Here's a short review of Chapter 6, The Land Changes Hands. Following the fur trade in the 1800s, the United States was a brand new country, and during this time, the United States had a little bit of an obsession with owning all of the land from the Atlantic Ocean all the way over to the Pacific Ocean. This was called westward expansion. In order to achieve westward expansion, the United States had to make treaties. Some of these treaties included treaties with France, Great Britain, Spain, and Native Americans. In class, we did an activity where we watched how the land that we now call Minnesota, which is in this region here, changed to the shape that we now know it today. So we started off by looking at a map of around the year 1600 and realizing that the first two groups of people to claim ownership to this land were the Sioux, or in other words, the Dakota, and the Ojibwe, or another name for them is the Chippewa. We also looked at a map of 1713 and realized that just 113 years later, some new people were coming into the area and naming this land many different things. Louisiana, Hudson Bay Company, and these lands were owned by these different countries. We started to realize through westward expansion that the name for what we now call Minnesota has changed. So according to this map, it was Northwest Territory, even parts of Spain, and even parts of the United Kingdom. As we move from map to map, we can see in this area that Minnesota starts to gain different owners, eventually leading to be called Minnesota Territory, and eventually the state of Minnesota. In order for Minnesota to become part of a state, treaties had to be written and signed between the Native Americans that lived here. The first treaties that were signed in Minnesota were at the confluence of rivers. These were the 1805 treaties, and sometimes known as the Fort Snelling treaties or the Zebulon Pike treaties. In 1805, a U.S. Army officer named Zebulon Pike arranged the purchase of two pieces of land from the Dakota for $2,000 in cash and goods. This was the first land deal in Minnesota. This land became the site of Fort Snelling in 1819. What we read in our book, also we learned that this treaty was signed with only the permission of 2 Dakota chiefs out of 7 Dakota chiefs that were present. The United States government didn't just choose any random piece of land. They were using strategy to try to choose a piece of land that would benefit them. So when choosing what would now be Fort Snelling area, they went and considered what the landscape was like. They definitely were looking for protection. They chose a site that was high up on bluffs to build their fort. Also, from high above, they had a very good view of the river below and anybody traveling on it. So their basic goal for this land treaty was to be able to control the rivers. The Dakota, on the other hand, also felt that this was a very important piece of their culture. They had a special word for where 2 rivers meet. Their word is Bedote. Our word is confluence. This map shows around the year of 1840, all of the different Dakota villages in what would now be called Minnesota. You can also see where St. Paul would be located and where Fort Snelling was located and where the fort would be built. So in this area was one of the land treaties, and this area was another land treaty. In order to understand the treaties, we have to understand the people involved in the treaties. We spent some time in class talking about how the American Indians view the land and the resources in Minnesota. We talked about how the Native Americans have always considered Minnesota their home, where all of their graves are located. The land, according to the Dakota, was full of resources: fresh water, sacred traditions, travel, a way to get sources of food. We also talked about that, especially at the Bedote, that was a very spiritual and like a religious place for the American Indians. On the other hand, the Europeans, the newcomers coming into the area had a different perspective of the land. They were interested in the soil and using the land for farming. They were also interested in the timber, the forest land that was around the area. Eventually that would be used for the timber industry, and that new industry would be helping out the new construction in the area. Obviously, the river to the newcomers was obviously a source of travel and fresh water, but also a way to power lumber mills and flour mills. The Native Americans saw the land as a necessity, whereas the newcomers saw the land as a way to benefit and power. After the Fort Snelling Land Treaty, another large treaty was the 1837 treaty, where the Ojibwe signed over much of their Minnesota and Wisconsin land to the United States government. This treaty was important to the development of a very important place, St. Paul. St. Paul's actual name before it was called St. Paul was Pig's Eye Landing, and this was named after a man who was nicknamed Pig's Eye. Europeans came coming into this land very quickly after the treaties were signed, even before some of the Native Americans got treaty money. They were coming to build sawmills on what we now know as Stillwater and Taylor's Falls. Another major development in Minnesota's history was when Minnesota became a territory in 1849. When Minnesota became a territory, the government had planned to offer the Native Americans a package deal in exchange for their land. The offer was that they would give them a cash payment immediately, annuities for 50 years, and a permanent reservation for the Dakota to live on. The government wanted to get the treaty signed. They had a motive, actually many motives. We talked in class about a motive is a reason for doing something or acting a certain way. The government, led by Alexander Ramsey, who was our first territorial governor, had a few motives. First was to expand the country across North America. That's called westward expansion. The government could not legally do this unless the Native Americans signed over their land. The government was interested in population increasing so that eventually Minnesota could become a state. Another main motive was to assimilate the Native Americans. Assimilation is a very fancy way of just forcing someone to fit in. The government was going to use part of the treaty money to teach the American Indians ways of life. And ultimately, their number one goal was to have the Indians contribute to American society. This included teaching them American skills, reading English, writing English, farming, anything that would benefit American society. So in summary, there were two goals for the United States government: westward expansion and assimilation. Fur traders were also interested in having treaties signed. The most important and famous fur trader in Minnesota history was Henry Hastings Sibley. Some background information was that Henry Hastings Sibley was involved in the fur trade at a very young age. He became a fur trade partner and eventually went into a relationship with a Dakota woman, and they had a child together, which is important to note because of this relationship. Henry Sibley was considered part of the Dakota family. And according to Dakota custom, Dakota people would treat their family with the utmost respect. Therefore, Henry Sibley had a close connection to the Dakota people. Henry Sibley and other fur traders were interested in the treaties being signed because they were also in debt. They wanted some of the annuity money from the Indians so that they could pay off their own debt. They were also interested in new jobs that would be available once the Indians had signed over their land. One new job was buying and selling treaty land to newcomers. other fur traders got into other businesses like lumbering. Missionaries were interested in having the treaty signed because they had an ultimate goal of converting the Dakota and the Ojibwe into Christians. They wanted to use some of the treaty money to do this, and so they would hopefully, their goal would be to assimilate and to educate the Indians in American ways of culture. There were many Dakota who had no interest in signing treaties with the American government, but there were some Dakota who saw that this could benefit them. They were hoping to retain a portion of their land that only they would be able to use as long as they wanted to. This was called reservation land. Their hopes were to live traditionally on this reservation land. They also wanted annuities for 50 years. The government was offering a payment of goods and food and cash once a year for 50 years after they signed the treaty. Right away, the government was going to give them cash just for signing the treaty. The cash payment was another motive. But probably the most important motive to remember is that the Dakota really thought they had no other choice. The Dakota saw this as either, number one, we sign the treaty and get reservations, annuities, and cash, or we don't sign the treaty and probably the government will take our land anyway and we'll get nothing in return. In July of 1851, the U.S. delegation comes to Minnesota at a place called Traverse des Sioux. They're there to negotiate the Treaty of Traverse des Sioux. Right away, when Alexander Ramsey opens up treaty negotiations, the Dakota are very reluctant to even speak because most of their tribal leaders haven't arrived yet. The next day, Ramsey threatens to stop negotiations because of the Dakota's lack of talking. They take a day break, they come back, and the Dakota on the next day say that they would like a copy of the treaty in writing. So Alexander Ramsey probably stays up most of the night, writes a treaty down on paper, comes back the next day just to have the Dakota say, yep, this looks pretty good. The following day, which would be the last day of treaty signing, there are many Dakota who are still really reluctant and voice their concerns about the treaty. Ultimately, they end up signing. They sign 2 copies of the Treaty of Traverse des Sioux, and then Stephen Riggs leads them over to another table. At that table, they sign what's known as the Traders' Papers unknowingly. In the Traders' Papers, the Dakota unknowingly are signing over the fact that they will pay back the fur traders with the money from the treaty agreement. About a week later, during the Treaty of Mendota, same type of process happened, only the government threatened to use force. Eventually, on the last day, they signed the treaty. Ultimately, between the Treaty of Traverse des Sioux and the Treaty of Mendota, this gold section through here is how much land the Dakota give over, about 24 million acres of land. In return, the Dakota get this red shaded area, which was to be their permanent reservation land. However, the Treaty of Traverse des Sioux was not ratified in its original form by the United States government. The government looked at Ramsey's treaty and decided that the natives should not keep all of this reservation land forever, that some of it would have to be returned to the United States government. In the end, the Dakota receive a cash payment, but most of that cash payment goes to the fur traders to be paid back for the fur trade. The Dakota do receive a reservation, but are later told that that reservation is not permanent, but temporary. And lastly, white settlers come rushing into Minnesota almost as soon as after the treaties are signed. Treaties still matter today. There are many treaties in Minnesota where the United States has given land to the Ojibwe and the Dakota in the form of reservation land. The true owners of the reservation land are the Native Americans that live there. They can write their own laws and follow their own laws. One such treaty that we talked about in class was the 1837 treaty with the Ojibwe.